found ourselves coming so often. And the first year of our marriage, we were taking our youth group from our church in North Carolina at the time to New York City on some kind of trip. And we said to each other then, wouldn't that be so fun to try urban living for a while? And so a few years ago, we decided to see if we could put that dream in motion and move to the neighborhood of Andersonville, if that means anything. And we really enjoy urban living. We walk to the store, we walk to the vet, we walk to the dentist, all those things. When we drive, we feel like it's a defeat, when we have to get into our car. So we are very much enjoying that. My context of ministry work right now is some spiritual direction. I have a practice and a few directees that I see. I would also say that the majority of my work is with a counseling center called Faithful and True. It is based out of the Twin Cities, and my husband and I both work with Faithful and True, and we've been commuting for 13 years, so a long, long time. We are the workshop directors, and we do a lot of small groups and one-on-one support. Faithful and True is a counseling center that largely focuses on coming alongside those that are dealing with a sexual addiction. And I can tell you that in the pandemic, we've only seen that need really grow. And I'm sure many of you, as you sit with people, are aware of all kinds of medicating behaviors, right, that have really increased over these last couple of years. But we feel very grateful to be involved in that meaningful work. And a little bit later on, I'll tell you more of how we got there. As I mentioned, my husband and I have two boys. They are 24 and 28 in just a couple of days. One is living in a Sprinter van. If you know what that is, think Amazon Prime, right? Traveling out west, working remotely, and mountain biking and rock climbing on the weekends, loving it. He's an Enneagram 7. Does that surprise you? And the other one is a senior at UT Austin. So I know that we've had some time to kind of settle in a little bit, but I have an exercise that I would like to invite us into now, to just invite you to check in more with how you're coming into our time tonight, okay? And so I have this for each of you. This is called A World of Experience, and it's a map, and my encouragement is that you find a place on this map that you feel like reflects at least a piece of where you're coming in tonight. There is so much on here, so I'm going to give you some good time to check this out, okay? There may be things that resonate with you in a profound way, maybe in a quirky way, maybe in a delightful way. When you feel like you have identified at least a place that represents how you come to this weekend, I want to encourage you to circle up with those at your table and share where you find yourself on the map and just a few minutes of why that resonated with you, okay? So when you're ready, you can kind of scoot your chairs around so you can share with each other. All right, I'm going to ask you, stay where you are for just a second. Can you just call out some of the places that you find yourself this evening?
I said Adventureland.
Adventureland, yes.
Forest of Changing Colors.
Oh, Forest of Changing Colors. Good.
I'm too young for that.
No.
Other places you find yourself this evening?
I'm in the same forest.
In the same forest.
Me too.
Lots in the Forest of Changing Colors. Okay. Yeah.
How old are you guys?
Any place else you find yourself this evening?
Awakenings.
Oh, good. Awakenings.
Soon and later planes.
Say that again.
The soon and later planes.
Soon and later planes. Yes. Yeah. I heard someone mentioning they'd like to be in the more wine island, right? That's a thing, right?
The aperitif or the.
Oh, the aperitif, yes. Oh, that sounds lovely, doesn't it?
John wanted to be at the place of cold beer.
Right.
I was drawn to the place of awareness and heart
Mm.
for whatever reason.
Yeah, good. And that's part of it too, and that's one of the things that I love about this map. By the way, this comes from a great book full of maps like this called The Atlas of Experience by a couple of different authors, The Atlas of Experience. And I love it because it invites us to consider all that we bring to our gathering tonight. Of course, over these last 2 years, you guys, we have all had such a world of experience. I mean, if that's all we did, even that would be such good, meaningful work this weekend, right? To hear and acknowledge all of the variety of things that we have known and seen and lost and grieved over these 2 years. And I would imagine that there was something that drew you to this topic and this idea that while we have known such experiences, hopefully also you are coming to know the strangely wrapped gifts that have come your way as a result, whether it's these last couple of years or throughout a variety of experiences in your life. There has been the pandemic, and then our lives have gone on in some form or fashion, right? And have unfolded, and so each of us has those things that we have had to deal with that have unfolded in our lives. And so I am drawn to, quite often, a beautiful book that you probably know by Jerry Sitzer named A Grace Disguised. And in it, one of the things that Jerry says is that across our life, a first death will come to us. And by first death, one of the things that he says is that could be a literal death, or it could be the death of a dream, or the loss of health, or the loss of a relationship, something like that. He said a first death will come to us. What is not inevitable necessarily is a second death. And here's what he means by that. A first death, he says, is what happens to us. A second death is what happens in us if we refuse to be transformed by the first one. Let me say that again. A first death is what happens to us. A second death is what happens in us if we refuse to be transformed by the first one. And I don't know about you, but I know for myself there are ways in which second deaths can show up in me. It's like lights that flash on my dashboard telling me, you better check your engine. When I find myself resentful or contemptuous or snarky, right, or bitter, those are indications that something is not well in my soul. So I wanted to tell you just a little bit about my story of why I was drawn to this topic, why I've spent the last several years talking about strangely wrapped gifts and this idea of post-traumatic growth. About 17 years ago now, my husband Greg and I were both on staff at a large church out in the Chicago suburbs when his sexual infidelity came to light, and we refer to that as our explosion. There was simply kind of no other language that seemed to fit. And of course, there was all kinds of devastation personally with the betrayal and the deception. And then there was also the real chaos of how the church chose to handle that. Like many things, it was a both and. There were some things that the church did well, and there were some things that were gas on a hot fire, right? And so we began our own journey of doing our work. We were separated for about 6 months, and in that process, I am forever grateful that God put some people around me in so many words to say, there doesn't have to be a second death. There have been many firsts within this, and there doesn't have to be a second. And I was so thankful for that hope, because, you know, when you're lying on your bathroom floor, if you've ever had those kinds of losses, you absolutely want to cling to hope. And that gave me hope that there didn't have to be a second death in my spirit. Well, about 4 months into our separation, we found Faithful and True. And we went, it's a long story how all this happened, but we went in 2 separate cars from Chicago, which is no small little drive to the Twin Cities, right? And we ended up coming home together, which was symbolic of the real significant experience that happened there. And for so many, many reasons, we experienced this possibility of hope and restoration with the founding couple who had developed Faithful and True years ago out of their own explosion. And we watched the hope in them, and they spoke hope into us. And so several years later, then we began to do our work professionally to come alongside others in that situation. My guess is that all of you have absolutely known your first deaths of many different kinds. And so tonight and tomorrow and tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon, what I want us to explore is what are the strangely wrapped gifts that can come to us? What is the wisdom embedded in our lives? Now, one of the things that I want to say is that I would imagine that as we talk and share this weekend, there will be a variety of different losses that get conjured up for you. Some of them may have happened a while, or you've been processing through them in your own work as you sit with your spiritual director or a therapist, your safe people. There may also be some pretty fresh losses. And one of the things that I think is so important about this work as we talk about this is that we not rush to unwrap these strangely wrapped gifts. Because if we're not careful, we minimize our hurt, we minimize our loss, we shut down our need to grieve, right? And then, without intending to, it becomes more of a spiritual bypass, right? We want to bypass doing the work of seeing ourselves and being an empathetic witness to our pain. And so wherever you are in this process with whatever losses you come to this weekend with, I just want to say there's loads of freedom to be in the timeline that makes the most sense for you and to be honoring of yourself in that. So tonight we're going to talk about 3 strangely wrapped gifts. And the first one that I want us to talk about is this idea of validating our own reality by learning to name our losses. I don't know if you've ever had that experience where your reality was invalidated and you knew in your knower something and someone was saying to you, no, that's not what happened, no. And you start to question, am I crazy, right? Well, one of the things that is so meaningful is when we learn to acknowledge this really is what happened to me. And I think when we can name our various losses and the nuance of them, that in itself is a gift. It is validating our reality. I once heard that grief and loss can be anywhere on a continuum from a catastrophic loss all the way to nostalgia. You ever thought of nostalgia as grief? Isn't that interesting? There's an elementary school right across the street from our condo, and often, especially in the mornings, I'll look out and see the children gathering, and I'll just think, oh man, I miss those days when my boys were little. There's a preschool not too far from us, and regularly the preschool teachers will take the kids on a walk with a rope, and they're all in their little coats and mittens and everything, and my husband and I will just run to the window, like, oh, look, they are so cute, And there is a nostalgia in it from when our own boys were that young. And does this make sense? There's grief in that. They're not at that, like that season is beyond us at this point. So, I want us to just acknowledge a variety of ways that loss shows up in us. And here's one of the reasons that I believe this is so beneficial. We tend to minimize our loss, or at least our loss. At least it wasn't this. At least it isn't that. We should on ourselves too. I should be grateful. I should be thankful that at least, like that we double whammy ourselves with the should and the at least. And when we validate our reality, it invites us to center down and acknowledge, yes, this did happen. Now, is there a goodness in right sizing those things? Absolutely. There is, of course, a difference if someone has lost a loved one versus losing an important object in, say, a house fire. And they're all loss, right? And as spiritual directors, you know that so much of what we're trying to do to help other people is to create and foster an environment for presence, to allow us to be honest with what's really happening. And this is one of the ways that we can do that with loss. Let's take a look at some of these. Of course, there is a loss of life when you lose a loved one. And I just want to say, even in that category, there can be a sudden death or the loss of life that someone has been ill for a long time. My mother has late-stage Alzheimer's, and she was diagnosed about 12 years ago. And so it is a loss of life, right? It is such a loss of the quality of her life. And every now and then the curtain gets pulled back and I see a little bit of her. Some of you may have a similar situation. But you see, under that category even, there is such a difference of what that can look like. Maybe you've experienced a loss of relationship, and it could be there was a real break. Maybe there was a divorce. Maybe, whether it's been because of the pandemic or just other reasons, you've had a loss of, like a loss of friendship, where the friendship shifted. You're aware that that would have been the person you would have called when you were on the bathroom floor or just in a real dark time. And you no longer feel, for whatever reason, comfortable to make that phone call. You notice the phone doesn't ring as often coming the other way. Maybe there is an estrangement with an adult child. And maybe there are reasons that you can point to where there was an argument or a break. Maybe there has just been a shifting as they've married and there aren't as many opportunities for conversations. Do you see how when we validate our reality with this, like, yes, that's a loss. Sometimes it's the loss of dreams, where we have an awareness that maybe our profession isn't what we had imagined, or where we would live. Maybe we imagined living near our grandchildren, and we don't. Maybe there are things in our marriage that we had always imagined might be the case, and that's not the way it has unfolded. Sometimes we struggle validating our loss because that can be really scary to name some of those things. And the idea, and this is so important, is not that we wallow, right? It's that we are present. Is that we acknowledge, yes, this is true for me. Maybe it's a functional loss of our body, of our memory, of our parts of our mental health. Maybe we are caring for someone who is experiencing a functional loss. That in itself can be a loss. There is, I think, a real necessity to name material loss as a way that we experience grief. I think in the Christian community, a lot of times we can, at least this. And I want to acknowledge that, again, if the goal here is validating our reality, where we lose a house, or we lose a beloved car, or old photographs, a really meaningful piece of jewelry that belonged to our grandmother. I mean, any of these things, again, the idea is honoring what is true for us. This idea of a role loss is a big deal. And for many of you, as I hear you've moved around, there have been transitions in your job, we want to, again, sometimes deny the impact that a loss of a role has had on us. Maybe it's in your profession, maybe it's in your family, as you're empty nesters. We're not needed as much by our children. One of the things that this moves right into the next one, when we transition out of one role into another, specifically when we have chosen that transition ourselves, we minimize that. I don't know about you, but I know I can have a critical voice that says something like, "Stop it, you chose this." And then I shut down the process of moving through the grief. Like I was telling you just a little bit ago, we made the choice to move into the city, which for so many reasons is such a good fit for Greg and me. What's also true is that I moved out of Algonquin about a 3-minute car ride from one of my closest, dearest friends, Kristen. And while she understood why we moved and I understood why we moved, it still has been really challenging to lose the proximity of a friend. You know how, grabbing my purse, I'll be right there, right? 3 minutes around the corner. In November, she and her husband bought a new house that was around the corner from our old one. I mean, literally, I could stand at my house and look through the, one neighbor's yard to see hers. And I had to grieve all over again that leaving meant I missed the opportunity to not just grab my keys, I'll be right there, but I'm putting on my house shoes. I'm walking to your house, I'll be right there, kind of a friend. And yes, I chose it. And this is where we have to hold the both in. Because if we don't, we shut that part of us down and we're not validating our reality. The last one here, and this is by no means an exhaustive list, is a communal or collective sense of loss. Well, haven't we absolutely done that in the last few years, right? Whether it is around the pandemic, all the chaos and differing opinions about masks and vaccines and mandates, whether it's about all of the chaos with racial injustice, whether it's about the political climate, we have known that sense of communal loss. I was saying it earlier this evening, a couple of us were talking, that I heard a story on NPR just this weekend. It was Bessel van der Kolk, if you know, the author of The Body Keeps the Score. And one of the things that he said that made so much sense to me is that not only have we experienced the last 2 years as loss, and we know that collectively, he said, at least for present day, we've lost being able to be assured that this will go away anytime soon, right? Like, I can't just say, I'll see you in a month at the so-and-so event, right? And we can trust that that will happen and we'll be free and we won't be in masks and all the things. We have no idea what's coming. Now, of course, we've always never known fully what's coming, but this feels like a new ground, new territory. And as I was driving in my car, one of the few times I was driving, I was thinking, that made so much sense. That's like this future loss, that in the moment when I leave my friends, I can't say, I'll see you here. I'm looking forward to this. And that has impacted us. All right, so I'm going to ask you to stop and pause here and consider, given that list of loss, over the last few years, maybe it's had to do with the pandemic, maybe not, but in recent history, can you name a loss, can you think of a loss or two that maybe you feel a little more permission naming given this list? Does that make sense? What are some losses that maybe have a little more nuance that you can allow yourself to actually welcome as, yes, that's a loss, okay? And what I'm going to ask us to do is, this might involve moving just a little bit, but there are 14, so there's an even number. I'm going to ask that you find one other person this time. And so it might mean getting up and moving around. And would you share, this is the loss that I'm aware of, that maybe I had not acknowledged or validated. So let's take just a second and give you an opportunity to think about that. And then in just a minute, I'll have you. Let me ask you as you are heading back to your seats, what do you notice in yourself, even in your body, as you acknowledge to another and are heard in that process about naming this loss? What do you notice? What are you aware of?
I think there's like a little release or something.
Yeah. I'm curious, Roxy, do you feel that anywhere, particularly in your body?
Core, I guess.
Yeah. I'm a big believer of us acknowledging what have we been holding, right? What have we been bracing? And so much of naming our reality is learning to exhale. It doesn't change the loss, but it certainly validates our reality. Someone else, what did you notice in that? What were you aware of?
I would say, like, it's interesting that you should say that, because I was going to say a lump in my throat. And to me, like, maybe I didn't really let it go yet.
Oh, yeah. That's a good awareness of, is there some grief there that you're just starting to really tap into? Yes. Anybody else?
Sadness,
Yeah.
core emotion.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we know is that we're thankfully becoming so much more trauma literate. And I would imagine that many of these losses involve some trauma. And thankfully, we are able to recover and move through our trauma and heal from it, not get over it. You notice there's a different language. But one of the key components is an empathetic witness. When we have an empathetic witness, it invites us to heal and to move through our trauma. Now, what you just experienced, right, was an empathetic witness. How did you know that your partner was listening? Like, what were some of the ways that you had that sense?
The facial expressions.
Okay, yeah, the facial expressions, which we sadly lose a lot of in a mask. Yes, what
I was
else?
gonna say, and the eyes, the acknowledgement, the understanding of that piece.
Yes. Yes.
There's a posture that leans towards and your, how do you position your head? Because, you know, your head, if it leans or tilts, you know, that all conveys.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, it really does.
Connection and, yeah.
Right. One of the strangely wrapped gifts, I believe, is that as we acknowledge various ways we've experienced loss, we can learn to be an empathetic witness to others and to ourselves. Now, as spiritual directors, you sit with people all the time and hopefully offer that empathetic witness, right? With your body posture, with your voice, with your eyes, with your words, validating that makes sense, you know, all of those kinds of things. Are you an empathetic witness to yourself? Here's what I mean by that. If you're thinking, what would that look like? Right? Just like, remember when our kids were little, if you have children, you might put your hand on their chest when they were upset and say, it's okay. Right? There's something about this posture right here that is a posture of nurture and comfort and validation and calm, like it's okay. And one of the things that I believe we can learn to do with ourselves is simply put a hand on our chest and take a deep breath and say, okay, you've been through a lot. No wonder you're sad. There is a lot of grief here. You're carrying a lot. This is a heavy load. When we learn to be a gracious host for ourselves, the way that we seek to be gracious host for others as spiritual directors, it shifts our internal being, right? It validates our reality, and it invites us into presence. I mean, this is good in and of itself, that it validates our reality. And the reason that that's a gift is because it invites us into presence, right? The next strangely wrapped gift that I think is so important is that we actually embrace learning how to journey with our grief. Now, this may not be new to many of us, and what I tend to find for myself, even though I have this conversation a lot, is that I'm really good at resisting journeying with my grief. I can tell you the steps, I can tell you why it's important, and that's still not the same as saying yes to it, right? So of course we're aware of the Kubler-Ross steps, but I want to show you tonight something a little, maybe it's different to you, and then quickly I would imagine this will feel like it resonates as a way that we can journey with our grief. I want you to imagine, okay, my drawing's bad, but that's really bad. Let's try that again. All right. Okay, I want you to imagine grief like this. Now, of course, it's not linear, and all metaphors, you know, lose something if you carry them 100% out. But I do think that this is often the way that we feel about journeying with our grief, because it feels like a chasm, right? And we kind of look over it and think, oh, I go there, I can't do the other things I've got to do, which is one of the false beliefs that we have about grief. Because actually we are well equipped to pendulate. Are you familiar with that word? There's a really good gift in the idea of learning to pendulate with our grief. So we move towards it, and then we come back. James Finley says something along the lines of we move towards the source of our pain and then back to the source of love. Isn't that a beautiful name for God? The source of love. And so we do have that capacity. It can be a learned muscle, but we have that capacity to learn to pendulate with our grief. Well, one of the ways that I think is really helpful for us to understand grieving is to imagine it in these categories. And again, this isn't, you know this, it's not linear. But this right here kind of represents death, where we sort of fall off a cliff oftentimes. Sometimes it's more subtle than that. But whatever the loss is, if it's a transition, if it's a role change, if we've lost someone we love, if there's a change in a relationship, this death represents an important stage of the process that is scary. We might feel angry. There might be a lot of emotion. There might be bargaining. It can be pretty visceral. There could be a lot of tears in this stage right here, okay? Then, this place here is burial. And I don't know about you, but a lot of times even in our conversations about death, burial, and resurrection, we skip over this, right? We just talk a lot about where are we going. And you guys, this is such an important part of journeying with our grief. And part of what happens here is that this is vacant. This is where we feel kind of empty. This is where we might not feel like praying or talking or processing. We might feel some anger at God. We might feel anger at a host of people. But this right here can often be represented with a real sense of vulnerability, a complete sense of disorientation and loss, and a real sense of being vulnerable. Well, I know in my own story, when I experienced this place, I had never before not been able to pray. I didn't, I just had never really experienced anything in life up till, our explosion 17 years ago that left me feeling like there are no words. And I had this lovely green chair that some friends gave me. And so there would be many mornings when the only thing I could do was just crawl in that chair. That's it. There were no words. Well, a few years after that, I was reading Sue Monk Kidd's When the Heart Waits. And one of the things that she talks about in there is the Garden of Gethsemane, right? And she says that she began to read that story in new light. And she said she was reading Jesus' words, "Sit here while I pray. Sit here while I pray. Sit here while I pray." And she says she felt thunderstruck at the idea that maybe there are times in our life where there are no words. We are in a season of burial, and God comes to us and says, "Sit here while I pray." She goes on to write, it turns out that's scriptural, that the Spirit intercedes on our behalf with groans too deep for words, right? One of the things that this is a strangely wrapped gift, but if you are in burial, right, it's so helpful to know that's a thing. You see what I'm saying? Like to validate, I'm not crazy. this pain is so real, this loss is so visceral, that if I feel empty and vacant, I'm not done. And this is where I am. I am in burial. Then, of course, thankfully, we can move into resurrection. And again, this isn't going to happen overnight. And as we journey with our grief, we allow ourselves to lean in. We allow ourselves to feel it. We move through it. We begin to have a sense of new life, of hope. We can take risks, right? There may be acceptance, and this is important, albeit sorrowful acceptance. Does that make sense? There may be things in our lives that we would never imagine saying yay about. And we are learning to welcome what is and have a sorrowful acceptance that that is where we are. What's also true is that this can be reorientation. Maybe you have read or listened to Mirabai Starr, and she does a lot of work with Richard Rohr and experienced a profound loss in her life years ago when her 13 or 14-year-old daughter committed suicide. And one of the things that she said that I found so helpful as she was reflecting back on that, she said, you know, it's not like the flu. It's not like something you're going to get over. What is true is that it's more like an amputation, and you learn to reorient the way that you live your life. I had the privilege of teaching at North Park Seminary this past fall, and one of the students was commenting about that story. I had them watch a YouTube video with Mirabai, and she said, you know, my dad lost a leg several years ago, and she said, that comment made so much sense to me about how we reorient. She said, I had to watch him completely reorient to walking and living his life without his leg. And catastrophic loss in particular is like that. And lest we, take care not to minimize other losses, this is important that reorientation is part of this. Now, here's what I think can be really helpful. When we journey with our grief, again, not linear, but this is the idea, right? That we are allowing ourselves to center down and name what's true. And that is a strangely wrapped gift, but this is where it takes us. Here's what I think is our propensity. We want to build a bridge across that. And that's another place we experience a spiritual bypass. Are you familiar with that language? This idea that I'm going to pray my way through and I'm not going there. I am not allowing myself to be present to validate what's really true. Now, often it's because we're absolutely fearful of this, right? And we think that we can't pendulate. We believe it will swallow us whole. And I absolutely want to say that if we are experiencing depression or we're sitting with people that are experiencing that, that's a different ballgame, right? We have to acknowledge that. But what's also true is that we serve the man of sorrows. So if that is the case, which I believe it is, and we are part of being Christ-like, right, is learning that sorrow is something that we are capable of and can survive. Right? Does this make sense? So here's the thing that I think I can just own for myself. I have seen this in my life. I think I'm out of other colored markers. When I avoid this, what starts happening is it makes itself known. right? This is when I am snarky, I am bitter, I am contemptuous, right? I withdraw, I shut down, I binge watch, I eat too much, I drink too much. You see what I'm saying? Right? Because we would rather numb and medicate what we don't want to journey with. And when we learn to journey with it, to sit with, okay, what am I sad about? I mean, really, you guys, these questions, I believe that the Holy Spirit, our teacher, does not want it to be this complicated thing. I believe it can be, what am I sad about? What am I angry about? What has this loss cost me? Like asking some of those questions and allowing ourselves to center down and be present with that. What I can own for myself is that when I am running from my grief, that actually weighs more. I feel it. I feel it right here. And I get over busy. When my kids were young, I would overparent, anything to avoid this. And yet, part of the faithful fullness of our stories is that there is beauty here. It is a strangely wrapped gift that takes us through to resurrection, to risk, to new life, to hope. Is this making sense? One of the things that I would add about this is we absolutely cannot do this without slowing down. This doesn't happen on the fly. And actually, I think because of the pandemic, and we've gotten quieter, I think it's one of the reasons some of the addictions have increased. Because it gets a little too loud internally if we're not quite ready to sit with what it is that we have lost, with what it is that we're aware of that we need to journey with, right? All right, a final piece for this evening. So that friend that I mentioned that I had moved away from, we are good enough friends that I was invited to be a part of her labor and delivery when she was giving birth to her first child several years ago. And it was Christmas Eve, and Riley, who we were all waiting on that night, was in no real hurry. It was about 10 days after the delivery date. And so the star of the night, I think, was the midwife, Glinda. Isn't that a great name for a midwife, right? And Glinda was this perfect mix of tender and strong and feisty. And that's exactly what we all needed. She was kind of a midwife to all of us that night. But particularly, she was especially good with my friend, Kristen. And she would say to her, I want you to try this particular way of breathing or walking or moving. When it was time to push, she gave very specific instructions of just how to do that and, some unique ways. I didn't know this was possible, but it is possible. When you're in labor and delivery, the big thing is how far dilated, right? And my friend actually went backwards for a little bit. And I did not even know that was possible. So can you understand how weary, right, she was getting? And there came a point in the night where, as many laboring moms say, I can't do this. I cannot do this. Maybe you've been there or you've been with a spouse that has felt that way. And this is the thing that I loved about Glinda. Glinda showed up at that point. And she got right up to my friend and said, oh, yes, you can. Oh, yes, you can. You were made for this. Now, I can't do this for you, but you've got this, and I'm going to be here with you. Well, one of the things that I think is such a gift in this idea for us is to imagine that we could understand God as a midwife. Again, Sue Monk Kidd has said, how did we ever get the idea that God was merely a rescuer and not a midwife? Isn't that powerful? How did we ever get the idea that God was merely a rescuer and not a midwife? Now, I'm very thankful that God rescues. There are certainly ways that that is true of God's character. What's also true is that God longs to bring something forth. And that's the definition of midwife, one who helps to produce or bring something forth. Well, one of the things that I see so often when loss hits is that it challenges our image of God, right? We tend to want to question who God is and whether or not God has shown up. We often think things like, if life is, maybe we don't say this, all right, but we tend to discover if life is good, God is good. And if life is not good, we wonder about God, right? Now, maybe you sit with people who are in the midst of difficult situations and they're wrestling with God. And they are struggling with how they view God and how God has or hasn't shown up for them. One of the things that I think is a strangely wrapped gift is that grief, if we allow it, will almost always take us to a more accurate perception of God. Grief, if we allow it, will almost always take us to a more accurate perception of God. And yes, we will always see dimly this side of heaven. And I wonder if we can see a little more clearly. See, the thing that is true in our grief is that we start with why questions. And that's part of this, you guys. That's part of our death and our anguish, is that we are asking, why was this allowed? Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't I know? Why couldn't I have not driven down that road? I mean, all the things, right? And asking why is perfectly normal and even good. I mean, it's part of how we journey with our grief. And one of the things that I believe can be really helpful is if we begin to understand God as midwife, we begin to move then from why questions to what. Now that takes a while. This is not, the what questions aren't here. The what questions are as we are moving. In fact, it's one of the ways that we are journeying on to hope. We begin to ask questions like, God, what is it that you want to form and shape in me, right? What is it that is the larger story here? Not that God ever caused this, but what is it that you want to, how you want to use this in my life? As we close this evening, here's what I'm going to invite us to do. I have several what questions that I'm going to read, and I'm going to read them in the manner of Lectio Divina. I'll give you this list here in just a minute, but I first want you to hear them and let them kind of just roll over and kind of let you soak in them, okay? And then I'm going to give you some time to see, is there one in particular that if God is coming to you as a feisty, tender, strong midwife, is there something that God is wanting to invite you into? All right? So I want to just invite you to close your eyes. Take a deep breath. allow yourself to exhale, a real cleansing breath. Anything that you're holding, allow yourself to release. And I'm going to read these questions with some space and quiet in between. This first time through, just listen to the questions. What do you want to form and shape in me, God? What do you want me to let go of, to surrender, to welcome? What part of me needs awakened? What part of my false self needs to be shed so my wise self can be more present? What in me do you want to heal? What in me do you want to birth? As I read these questions a second time, see if there is one, maybe two, that something about it, you wonder if that is for you this evening. What do you want to form and shape in me, God? What do you want me to let go of, to surrender, to welcome? What part of me needs awakened? What part of my false self needs to be shed so that my wise self can be more present? What in me do you want to heal? What in me do you want to birth? As I read them a third time, see if there's an invitation in what you're hearing. What do you want to form and shape in me, God? What do you want me to let go of, to surrender, to welcome? What part of me needs awakened? What part of my false self needs to be shed so my wise self can be more present? What in me do you want to heal? What in me do you want to birth? In a fourth and final reading, consider if you have a response, or just simply allow the questions to wash over you again. What do you want to form and shape in me, God? What do you want me to let go of, to surrender, to welcome? What part of me needs awakened? What part of my false self needs to be shed so my wise self can be more present? What in me do you want to heal? What in me do you want to birth? I'm going to just allow for some time of quiet. I'm going to play some music, and I just invite you to, you can write if there's a response that you've heard, or you can just sit and continue to know. God, I am so thankful that you are presence, and you invite us into presence. I am thankful that you are rescuer, and I am thankful that you are midwife. May we attune to what you are inviting us into. In your name we pray. Amen. If you would like these, copy of those questions, I have those for you. And as we leave tonight, I just want to encourage you to continue to sit with whatever may be stirring around us.